Alright guys, Murph's here. And today we're going to be talking about the 40 Smith & Wesson compromise. Now you might be asking yourself, what is the 40 Smith & Wesson compromise? And that is that 40 Smith & Wesson has the knockdown power of the 45 and the capacity of the 9mm. So what I have assembled here today, some data, a lot of data actually, a lot of numbers, and we're going to compare quite a few different cartridges and get an understanding of what exactly we mean by the knockdown power and the capacity type argument, all right? So this is going to be a very data-rich conversation that we're having. We're going to touch on a couple different types of concepts and all that kind of stuff. So if you're not looking for a conceptual debate, some fact-driven opinions, and a whole lot of numbers, I suggest that you check out someone else's video. Now, in order to be able to talk about the 40 Smith & Wesson, we have to first talk about a little bit of history with the Miami-Dade shootout. Now, you might be asking yourself, what is the Miami-Dade shootout? That's all right. Give me a second and I'll tell you. So the Miami-Dade shootout was an event in 1986 Florida in which the FBI cornered two bank robbers and murderers and had a shootout with them. There were 8 FBI agents against these two murderers. They attempted a pit maneuver on the bank robber's vehicle, which was not entirely successful. It did immobilize the vehicle, but it actually did more to disrupt the FBI attack than it actually did to limit the amount of resistance the perpetrators gave. Now, the FBI showed up to this fight with 2 12-gauge shotguns, 3 issued Smith & Wesson Model 459 9mm second-generation semi-automatic handguns, 5 .38 special revolvers, and 2 .357 Magnum revolvers. Now, those 5 .38s were also some backup guns for a couple of guys. The perpetrators that they were trying to either capture or kill were carrying a 12-gauge shotgun, a Ruger Mini 14, and 2 .357 Magnum revolvers. During the conduct of this shootout, 145 rounds were exchanged between the two parties, and the numerically superior force of FBI agents was whooped pretty soundly. They still won the fight. They killed the 2 perpetrators, but 2 FBI agents died and 5 were wounded, leaving 1 guy out of the entire party unscathed. And this really caused a major ripple effect throughout the entire law enforcement community, especially when it's the FBI. It was a huge black eye for the FBI, and there was an investigation that ensued afterwards, of course. Just like any other shooting, just especially one where so many agents got injured and killed. They found that the perpetrators were shot multiple times each. One man was shot 6 times, the other was shot 12 times before they died, before the fight ended, effectively. And what the FBI discovered was that their handgun cartridges were not effective enough to end the fight early. So this caused an inevitable, but not unexpected, overreaction from the government side of things. So the FBI decided to sideline the 9mm, and they helped develop the 10mm cartridge. Now, 10mm is a really cool cartridge. I'm actually very happy to see it come back into popularity. For years, I was throwing out the 10mm as kind of an option to my 45 caliber, my 45 ACP diehard friends who just everything had to be 45. I would always just kind of float 10mm out, and I actually got a couple of early converts back, man, it'd be like 10 years ago now, to the 10mm cartridge. The original FBI loading for the 10mm was a 170 grain bullet moving at 1,300 feet per second and generating around 600 foot-pounds of energy. That's a lot of cartridge. That is so much power. That is actually outpacing quite a few 357 Magnums, and that's super impressive. The Smith & Wesson hopped on with the FBI for this new cartridge, and they produced a model of their 3rd generation semi-automatic pistols, the Model 1076, for that cartridge. And at first, everything was great. There was a big movement. Norma was the original developer of the cartridge. Colonel Jeff Cooper was really advocating for how fantastic it would be and all this kind of stuff. But there was a problem. And it was that a lot of agents were having trouble qualifying with the handgun. Now, a lot of people will turn this into a macho thing, and they'll say that either it was an issue with the desk jockeys or women were having trouble qualifying with the handgun. But the reality is that the FBI recruits from a very wide demographic of people, and firearms proficiency is not the foremost thing that they're looking for. In fact, a lot of these people probably haven't touched a firearm prior to going to the academy. So when you're trying to train brand new shooters on a heavy recoiling handgun and cartridge, you're going to have some training issues. You're going to wind up spending a lot of time and effort trying to get guys to be able to qualify, and you're going to have to do that every time they have to go up to qualify if they don't use the guns very often. So it very quickly became apparent to the FBI that this system was not working. So at first they came out with a downloaded 10mm cartridge, which was sporting a 180 grain bullet, moving at 950 feet per second and generating right around 350 foot-pounds of energy. And after that, they decided that they had a lot of unused case capacity, so they wound up coming up with the 40 Smith & Wesson. So the 40 Smith & Wesson cartridge hits the market, comes out in 1990. The FBI adopts it, and when the most premier law enforcement agency in the country adopts a cartridge, it's not too long before everyone else follows suit. And you see the 40 Smith & Wesson really ramp up in popularity, and a lot more guns start to come out for it. Heckler & Koch, SIG, Beretta, Glock, Smith & Wesson, all these guys start producing guns in 40 Smith & Wesson. Now, there wind up being a couple of issues. At first, the guns that hit the market are in 9mm frames. Smith & Wesson and Glock, foremost among them, built their guns on 9mm frames and then put 40 caliber holes in them, more or less. And what they found out was that the 40 Smith & Wesson is a high impulse cartridge. Most people will characterize 40 Smith & Wesson recoil as being very sharp, very snappy. And that pressure curve and the slide velocities and all that kind of stuff are moving at that sharp pace. So what they found was excessive wear on the frames, and actually it was not that uncommon to have those frames crack. Now, SIG and Heckler & Koch, when they made their introductions of their pistols, they built them on true 40 caliber frames, and that fixed the problem. Now let's go ahead and let's get into kind of the nitty-gritty, boring, data-driven part of this review here, or this conversation. Let's call it a conversation. I like that better. I'm not reviewing this 40 Smith & Wesson cartridge. We're talking about the 40 Smith & Wesson cartridge. So we're going to compare a couple of loadings across a couple of different calibers. Now, the calibers that I picked, of course, are the 40 Smith & Wesson, 9mm and 45, because those are the calibers that are most often talked about anytime somebody talks about 40 Smith & Wesson. But then I also threw in 357 Magnum and 38 plus P, because those were common police handguns at that time. Now, the data that I have, I went ahead and I selected the most common loadings for each of these cartridges. I did 2 per caliber. And then I also went to Lucky Gunner's website and I selected all of my data from there. And I decided on the grainage, and then I picked a load that matched what it was that I was after. I didn't spend a lot of time. I kind of did it at random. Now, Lucky Gunner, if you guys haven't looked at it, you really should. If you go to their website, they have a comprehensive chart of a whole bunch of different loadings from a bunch of different calibers. They're constantly updating it. I've been following it for over 3 years, and it seems like every couple of months they add a whole new layer to their charts, covering all the common calibers, all the self-defense cartridges that you possibly could want to, and a lot of the different loadings throughout. And they're always staying on top of it. It's a really fantastic resource. I use it to select all of my personal defense loads. I highly recommend you do the same. It's only covering pistol bullets right now, though. Right now. So I went through their list, and I would decide, 180 grain 40 Smith & Wesson, I would pick 180 grain 40 Smith & Wesson load at random, and then I would record that data. And that's all I did, guys. There's no agenda here that I'm trying to prove or anything like that. I fully embrace that if you spend enough time looking through enough people's data, you will find whatever information you want to support your opinion. I'm just throwing some stuff down on some paper and showing a comparison to drive towards what I believe the true conclusion is here. All right, so let's go ahead and start talking through my chart here. All right. Now, before I get too far into the chart, let's go ahead and talk about FBI ammunition testing protocol. So the FBI has been spending a lot of time testing ammunition and coming up with their own protocol for doing so. And what they do is they have a couple of gelatin blocks, all right? And in front of those gelatin blocks, they put 4 layers of denim, and then they fired whatever load they're testing into that. FBI standard is for the penetration of the cartridge to be between 12 and 18 inches of penetration in order to qualify for duty or self-defense use. They would prefer to see things on the 18-inch side. Now, I say that not because, most people will say, oh, well, how many people do you know that have a 12-inch thick chest? First off, there's a lot of really chubby people walking around out there. So let's hold our horses on saying that most people are 18 inches thick. You've been in the local Walmart lately? I'm just saying. However, what it really comes down to, and the first most obvious response to that, is that the FBI wants to be able to accommodate having to shoot from someone's hip to their shoulder. All the way across that. That's getting closer to that 18 inches of penetration. In addition to that, ballistic gelatin is not a one-for-one of the human body. It is supposed to represent muscle and tissue, but it doesn't necessarily represent bones or moving through different air and fluid-filled organs and stuff like that, and how that might change penetration characteristics. All ballistic gelatin is a standardized method of testing so that you can replicate results and pull data from what it is that you're looking at. That's all it does. It just generates data. It's a consistent data generation platform. Now, why 4 layers of denim? So 4 layers of denim is supposed to be able to qualify whether or not a hollow point bullet will choke full of a material and not expand. So when Lucky Gunner does their testing, they use FBI standard and they catalog absolutely every aspect of it. They catalog penetration distance. They show you a picture of the first bullet in gelatin, and then they do a 5-shot string and they show you all 5 shots in ballistic gelatin. Then they pull the bullets out of ballistic gelatin and they take a picture of the expansion of all 5 bullets so that you can check and make sure that the round uniformly expands and reaches optimum expansion as well. Optimum expansion being 50% with full weight retention. Then they weigh the bullets at the end. They generate velocity and they generate energy and all that kind of stuff. They catalog all of it. It's a really fantastic chart. Now let's get into my chart though. So, 40 Smith & Wesson. I selected the 180 and 165 grain bullets for my chart. The 180 moves at 920 feet per second, generates 338 foot-pounds of energy, and penetrates 14.7 inches. All right? Right past the minimum for FBI standards. The 165 grain bullet moves at 1,098 feet per second and generates 441 foot-pounds of energy and still only penetrates 14.7 inches. Interesting, right? That you would have a little smaller bullet going almost 100 feet per second faster, generating almost 100 foot-pounds more energy, and still penetrates the same distance. Now for the 9mm, I selected the 115 and the 124 grain bullets. The 115 moves at 1,143 feet per second and generates 333 foot-pounds of energy. So it's moving over 100 feet per second faster and is generating just a little bit less energy with 65 grains less bullet than the 180 grain bullet. It penetrates 13.1 inches. So once again, we are just past FBI minimum and we're about an inch less penetration than a 40 Smith & Wesson. Now the 124 grain 9mm moves at 1,097 feet per second, generates 331 foot-pounds of energy, and penetrates 19.7 inches. So now we have an over-penetration situation. Now, under-penetration is not good because it's going to take more rounds to be able to subdue your opponent. Over-penetration is not good because now you potentially have a situation where a bullet passes completely through a suspect and kills little Timmy behind him. So neither extreme is acceptable. You do want something in the middle. You'll also notice that once again, the 124 grain is not that different from the 115 grain, which was not that different from the 180 grain 40 Smith & Wesson. Might be seeing the start of a trend here. Now let's get into the 45 ACP. I swear I just heard like a roar of 2 world wars somewhere just now. All right, I selected the 185 grain and 230 grain bullet. The 185 grain moves at 908 feet per second and generates 338 foot-pounds of energy. That is exactly the same as the 180 grain 40 Smith & Wesson, and penetrates 13.8 inches. So it actually still doesn't penetrate as much as a 40 Smith & Wesson, a little bit more than a 9mm, about an inch play in either direction, and generates just as much energy. Interesting, right? The 230 grain 45 ACP, moving at 794 feet per second, generates 321 foot-pounds of energy and penetrates 22.2 inches. So we definitely have an over-penetration situation. And I think that one kind of jumps to the other extreme right now. I think that particular bullet may not have been the best expansion. So if the bullet doesn't open up very well, it's obviously going to penetrate deeper. Like I say, guys, this is not a perfect representation. This is just a sampling. I really do implore you guys to look at those charts and kind of draw your own conclusions. Now, the 357 Magnum. I selected 158 grain and 125 grain loadings. The 158 grain 357 moves at 1,181 feet per second, generates 489 foot-pounds of energy, and penetrates 32 inches. That is way too much penetration. And it's kind of an issue with 357 Magnum bullets in general, if you think about it. The 125 grain 357 Magnum moves at 1,418 feet per second, definitely a winner on the velocity scale. Generates 557 foot-pounds of energy, definitely a winner on the foot-pound scale, and penetrates 16.1 inches. What a fantastic middle ground when it comes to penetration. It's not too much, but it's also not too little. You could draw a conclusion that 357 Magnum is clearly the superior handgun cartridge thus far, and I wouldn't fault you for it, but you do come back to a recoil problem, and also a capacity and weight issue. Now, 38 plus P. Very common police handgun option at this time. I still selected 158 and 125 grain bullets. The 158 grain 38 plus P moves at 892 feet per second, generates 279 foot-pounds of energy, and penetrates 22.9 inches. That's clearly a not very good expanding hollow point that was being used. The 125 grain plus P moves at 989 feet per second and generates 271 foot-pounds of energy, penetrating 12.5 inches, just barely past the minimum. So, in comparison to everything else, the 38 plus P is fairly anemic in about every possible way, except penetration, which we don't want it to be. The 357 Magnum is coming in strong, and in some cases entirely too strong, and comes with its own detractor because of that. Whereas the 45, 9mm, and 40 are actually posting all pretty similar foot-pounds, fairly similar velocities, and penetration is almost dead on with everything else. So what conclusions do I draw from this? The first thing that I want to say is that if we're talking about a compromise, right? The literal definition of compromise is that both sides make concessions. And I think that is very true here in general. So do we have the knockdown power of a 45 in the 40 Smith & Wesson? To some extent we do. The foot-pounds, the energy alone are very comparable, and you could make a pretty good argument that you're getting 45 style ballistics out of a 40 Smith & Wesson. It's not one for one, but if you just look at the raw data, they're not that dissimilar. So, all right, fine, the 45 aspect of this crowd wins, but what about the 9mm? So now consider that at this time that most 9mm handguns carried 15 rounds, whereas most 40 Smith & Wesson handguns carried 12. An exception would be the Glock 22 full-size 40 Smith & Wesson handgun that carried 15. But that's also because a Glock 17 full-size 9mm handgun carries 17 rounds, 19 with an extended base plate, of course. So you get kind of close to the capacity, and you definitely get more capacity than a 45 ACP, but I would not consider it a one-for-one swap on capacity. So that side of it's not entirely borne out. What I think the most important takeaway from this chart is that most of your semi-automatic handgun cartridges are not that dissimilar in what they do downrange. And what it really comes down to is that if you know you're walking into a fight, a handgun is not the thing you should be grabbing. A handgun is viable for fighting because a handgun is more portable and more likely to be carried than anything else. There's a reason that not every soldier in the military walks around with just a handgun. That everybody has rifles and everyone is proficient with rifles. Rifles and shotguns are more proficient fight stoppers than any semi-automatic handgun. Any. Don't even, like, throwing out any caliber, 357 Magnum, 10mm, all those guns, a rifle or a 12-gauge slug will still do it better. Regardless. The velocities, mass, all that stuff, none of it's going to be able to match what a rifle can do. Now, if we talk about availability, we start to see some trends change here. Now, the FBI has gone back to the 9mm loading. They have dropped the 40 Smith & Wesson, and so have a lot of police departments, because once again, the leading law enforcement authority in the country made the change, so everyone else is going to follow suit. Why is that? And a lot of that has to do with modern bullet construction. Now, in that 1986 Miami-Dade shootout, one of the FBI agents moved towards one of the perpetrators and fired all 6 shots out of his .357 Magnum revolver. Now, 2 of the shots missed wide entirely. 4 of the shots connected, and at least 2, if not 3 of the shots went into the suspect's face. Now, one of those shots from his .357 Magnum revolver, the bullet struck the man's facial bones and broke in 2. And both pieces went and did minimal damage. That I'm sure they did some pretty terrible aesthetic damage, but they didn't stop the fight. It was the next round that went in after them that actually managed to make it all the way to a spinal column. But that first round split in 2, and we're talking a .357 Magnum broke apart. And that's very common for this time. When you're talking about the 80s and 90s and before that, there's not a lot of good expanding hollow points. It would be unreal to expect that you would get 50% expansion out of a bullet with 100% weight retention. That would not happen. Bullets would flake apart. The metallurgy was not there yet to be able to bond soft and hard metals to be able to maintain weight and still get expansion. That didn't exist yet. So it made a lot of sense to run a 45 or a 40 in order to be able to have more mass in the bullet to be able to get that deeper penetration with whatever expansion it is that you manage to get out of the bullet. That made sense. That math checks out. Now with modern bullets, the things that we can do with modern metallurgy, we can have the best of both worlds. We can carry more of a lighter bullet that still penetrates deeply and expands widely. We don't have to have mass. We don't have to have a 165 to 230 grain bullet to be able to carry that round all the way through our perpetrator and actually make it to something that'll stop the fight. So with that being the case, a lot of 40 Smith & Wesson handguns have come up on sale as police departments have started to divest themselves of the guns. And at first, 40 Smith & Wesson took a major drop in price to where you'd get it between $13 to $16 a box. Now that a lot of that has ended, I'm seeing 40 Smith & Wesson $16 to $18 a box. It's affordable. It's not the most affordable thing I shoot, but it's also not the most expensive thing I shoot. Now, the other side of that is that a lot of my friends have been moving away from 40 Smith & Wesson handguns and getting 9mm or 45 ACP guns. And because of that, I've been coming into a lot of 40 Smith & Wesson from friends who no longer have a need for it. At the same time, there are a lot of gun shops. There's at least one gun shop in my area that won't even stock 40 caliber handguns anymore because they don't sell. They don't move. Everyone wants the lighter, faster, higher capacity 9mm guns. So it's kind of sounding the death knell for the 40. And in this case, I don't mean to detract from the 40 because I actually really like the cartridge. Not because I think it does anything any better, just because I don't think it does anything any worse. Now, would it be my go-to end of the world fight to save my life cartridge? No. But I do keep a 40 Smith & Wesson around. I keep a couple of 40 Smith & Wesson handguns around and a lot of ammunition for them, because with it being less popular, the ammunition doesn't disappear as quickly. And now that I'm living through my third ammunition rush, or arms Armageddon, I really appreciate the fact that I have a diversity in my handgun rounds and a lot stocked for each type. So I think the end state here is that a compromise, being a concession between two parties, does not necessarily mean that both parties win. Sometimes a compromise means that both parties lose. I wouldn't necessarily say that's absolutely the case for the 40 Smith & Wesson, but unfortunately with modern metallurgy and modern offerings, it's not doing it any favors either. So those are pretty much my thoughts, guys. If you have a rebuttal or another point of view on this subject, I would love to hear it. I really do endorse that you guys kind of participate in this conversation. These opinions of mine come from years of thinking on it, experimenting with stuff, and using my money and my time to help formulate my opinions. So I hope it's beneficial to you guys, and I do appreciate you guys tuning in today. So until next time, I'll catch you later.